Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but have left the public divided. Here, we're going to dive into a case that has left many questioning how easily the human mind can be influenced, no matter your social status, what power you have or control. The NXIVM case is not your ordinary tale of manipulation. It involves high-profile celebrity individuals, people we assume have everything together, who found themselves wrapped up in a dangerous cult-like organization. This was not about the vulnerable or down and out. This was about people with resources, with fame and influence that fell prey to something dark and manipulative. So, how does this even happen? How can powerful, successful people fall under the control of one man and his twisted vision? And more importantly, what does this case say about all of us and our vulnerability to influence? By the end of this episode, you are going to have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? Today in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion, we ask, NXIVM, under the influence or willing participants? All right, let's get into it. NXIVM, okay, it wasn't just another self-help group, okay? It was a sophisticated web of manipulation, control, and exploitation that lured in some of the most powerful, successful, and intelligent people from Hollywood and beyond. People like Allison Mack, who starred in a hit TV series, a wealthy heiress, Clare Bronfman, with seemingly endless resources at her disposal, fell under the spell of Keith Raniere. Raniere, the charismatic leader of NXIVM, convinced his followers they were a part of something revolutionary, an elite circle of individuals who were on the path to self-empowerment and enlightenment. But the truth? Well, that was far darker. As more details about NXIVM began to surface, it became clear that this was not the life-changing organization it claimed to be. Instead, it was a cult-like structure where women were coerced into becoming slaves, actually branded with Raniere's initials, and then forced to perform acts that left them both physically and emotionally scarred. The group's most devoted members, including Mack, became key recruiters, luring others into the fold. And in things like this, there's always that moment, right, where everything seems normal, but on the outside, you see this moment happen. It's just not normal anymore, and things get weird. And in this case, right here, this is exactly where the lines begin to blur. Were these high-profile individuals, people with fame and money and influence? Because we usually think of cult members and people that are being manipulated so successfully as those less fortunate, the truly vulnerable that don't have resources and are out there floating by themselves. And so, of course, they're easy to scoop up. But that was not the case here. Not the case at all. These famous people and powerful people became victims of a master manipulator, and they were powerless to resist his control, no matter who they were. That's one side. There's another side asking, were they just willing participants in all the crimes that unfolded? And were they fully aware of what they were doing? This question has divided public opinion in a way that few cases have before. And that's what makes it special, and that's why we're talking about it here. The confusion deepens when you consider the typical perception of cult followers. And I brought that up a second ago, but I really want to get into this because traditionally we think of those who fall prey to cults, for instance, as vulnerable. They're people that are lost. They're seeking some kind of purpose because they don't have one. They would like an identity because they lack one in their everyday lives. Their lives aren't meaningful, and they end up somewhere where they think it will help them. A more obvious path to these kinds of things happening But NXIVM turns that stereotype on its head, because here we're talking about some of the most wealthy and most successful people in the world. Individuals who, by all outward appearances, seemed to have it all. They weren't the lost and meek, they were the rich and powerful. So, how is it that they fell so hard so fast? It confused a lot of people about the whole case entirely. And what does this case reveal about the true nature of influence and manipulation? It can reach anyone. One of the most perplexing aspects of this case is that it challenges our understanding of influence in the first place. We often assume that people that have the money and the power and the success, well, they're just immune to these kinds of manipulations that ensnare those who are most vulnerable, right? They're only going to get those guys. But NXIVM shows us something kind of terrifying. Anyone, regardless of their status, can be influenced. And it raises the question, how much control do any of us really have over our own decisions? And how easily can someone else take the reins of our mind? Keith Raniere, he didn't target people who had nothing to lose. This was not his game, like a lot of cult leaders do. Oh no, he went after individuals who had everything, the fame, the fortune, the status, and he convinced them that they needed his guidance to reach their own full potential. His ability to infiltrate their minds, manipulate their desires, and ultimately push them to cross legal and moral lines is what makes this case so particularly chilling. These were people who, by all accounts, were aware of things in the world they should have known better. They were involved. They were people who had the resources to escape, but they didn't. Take Allison Mack, for example. She was a successful actress. She was adored by fans with access to a world of opportunities. In the field she chose, her dreams were coming true. Yet, she found herself deeply entangled in Raniere's inner circle, recruiting women into NXIVM's secret group, DOS, and helping to enforce its twisted rules. She wasn't just a passive participant. This woman became one of the most active players in Raniere's system of control. And Clare Bronfman, a Seagram's heiress with access to millions, she was not just a follower. Clare bankrolled NXIVM's operations. She used her vast resources to silence critics and protect Raniere. So how does this happen? How do people who seem so untouchable and perfect, they have it all, right? People admire them. How do they fall under the influence of just one man even? Was it Raniere's charisma? His intelligence? Was it something deeper? These are the questions that continue to haunt those who followed the case, and they're the same questions that made the NXIVM story so compelling. We have to ask ourselves, is there something about the human brain, no matter how strong or successful someone appears, that can be exploited? And if so, are any of us truly immune from any of this kind of influence? It is a disturbing thought, but one that NXIVM forces us to confront head on. The line between victim and willing participant is blurred, and it's that very ambiguity that keeps this case at the center of public debate. What makes NXIVM even more complex is that many of the people involved, particularly those in positions of power and influence, they stayed. They stayed in the group for years. They didn't leave when the red flags appeared, when reports of manipulation and abuse started to surface. Oh no, instead, they doubled down on their loyalties to Keith Raniere, defending him publicly and continuing to bring in new members. It makes you wonder, at what point does personal responsibility come into play? When do we stop being victims of influence and start being accountable for our own actions. And this is where the debate really heats up. There are those who argue that individuals like Mack and Bronfman, they were victims manipulated by Raniere into doing things they never, ever would have done on their own. But others believe that these women were far too smart and powerful to be mere pawns in someone else's game. They had choices. They could have walked away, but they did not. Does this make them just as guilty as Raniere himself? This question strikes at the heart of what makes the NXIVM case so controversial. On one hand, we see clear evidence of manipulation and control. On the other, we have to grapple with the fact that these were intelligent, resourceful individuals who willingly stayed in a system that harmed others. The law may have made its judgment, but the public opinion, it still is sharply divided. And that's the crux of the dilemma. I mean, can we truly call someone a victim if they had the means to escape and chose not to? Or was it possible that Raniere's influence was so powerful that it completely stripped them of their agency? These are the questions that make NXIVM one of the most fascinating and troubling cases in recent history. By the end of this episode, I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out where you stand, if you can. All right, well, the story of NXIVM, it begins in the 90s when Keith Raniere founded the organization as a self-help group designed to help people reach their highest potential. It was marketed as a way to unlock personal growth and empowerment, with seminars and courses that promised to teach participants the secrets to success, both personally and professionally. But beneath the surface of this seemingly positive movement was something far more sinister. NXIVM's structure was built on a system of control. Members were encouraged to take more and more courses. And of course, this is often at a great financial cost. We see this happen in groups like this all the time, after the fact, and we figure out, it's all bogus. But these people were told that by following Raniere's teachings, they would transform their lives. The group's rhetoric focused on ideas of self-improvement, personal mastery. But then over time, it became clear that Raniere was using these teachings to manipulate and control his followers. At the core of NXIVM was an inner circle known as DOS, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, a secretive subgroup exclusively for women. DOS operated on a master-slave hierarchy, with Raniere at the top as the ultimate master. Women in DOS were recruited by other female members who are also known as masters and were required to submit collateral, intimate, or damaging personal information. I want you to understand what that is. Something that you don't want anyone else to know that makes you vulnerable. You're going to give that to this man because he's going to make sure you don't ever talk about this. And they did it willingly. This was only used to ensure their loyalty and their silence, yet they did it anyway. Their most personal things. This would only be used, these things, to ensure their loyalty and their silence. This collateral was a key feature of NXIVM's control system, effectively trapping women in the group as they would fear public humiliation, or even worse, if they tried to leave. Once inside DOS, women were subjected to strict rules and tasks. These included things like starvation diets, sleep deprivation, and physical punishments. The most notorious practice was the branding ritual, where women were held down and branded with Raniere's initials. This is a permanent mark of their submission to the group. Allison Mack, who had risen to a high-ranking position within NXIVM, played a significant role in this recruitment and the branding process. using her celebrity status to attract new members and bring them into DOS. As NXIVM grew, so did its reach. What began as a small group eventually expanded to include high-profile individuals, including celebrities, wealthy entrepreneurs, and even political figures. One of the most shocking aspects of the case is the involvement of people who, by all accounts, appeared to have it all. Their presence in NXIVM, it shattered that stereotype that only the desperate and the vulnerable can be manipulated. It's something that protects everyone else, right? And we like that thought. If you're not desperate and vulnerable, you're safe. But suddenly, with this, the public was forced to ask, how does someone like Allison Mack, a beloved actress, or Clare, the billionaire heiress, end up so deeply controlled by someone like Keith Raniere? Brings up the important question, and it's for all of us. It's very easy to brush off situations like these when the victims are down and out and they're struggling with their lives, because we kind of expect them to more fall prey to manipulation in general. But when it happens to someone that, you admire, someone you look up to, how do you reconcile that? Really, how do you? You might not feel safe, but can you accept that they were manipulated? How can you resolve the idea that people who seem to have it all, their lives are together, they're strong, independent, how can they fall under the control of somebody else? It just doesn't even seem possible, does it, when you think about yourself? The answer, of course, though, forces us to acknowledge a hard truth. Mental influence is real, and no one is immune. NXIVM's ability to manipulate and control its members, whether they were struggling or successful, revealed the extent to which anyone can be vulnerable. Raniere crafted a system that didn't rely on preying solely on the weak. Instead, it preyed on human psychology itself. Didn't matter who you were. His tactics? Emotional manipulation, isolate the members from the outside world, create a dependence on his teachings. It all allowed him to break down even the most powerful individuals. And in the end, it just didn't matter how much money or fame or influence someone had, because once they were in NXIVM, they were under his control. And that was it, plain and simple. The fallout from NXIVM's exposure was swift and far-reaching. In 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested. He was in Mexico, and they actually extradited him back to the U.S., where he faced a range of charges. And the charges included things like sex trafficking, forced labor, and racketeering. This is a group, we got celebrities in there. It seems like a place you might want to be. It's a self-help, self-empowering group. And we have sex trafficking, forced labor, and racketeering. Just take that in. Allison Mack and Clare Bronfman, they were arrested, along with several other high-ranking NXIVM members, as investigators uncovered the full extent of the organization's abuses. During the trial, prosecutors painted a chilling picture of how NXIVM operated as a criminal enterprise, using manipulation and coercion to control its members. The women involved in DOS testified about the horrors they endured, from the branding rituals to the mental and physical abuse that they say left them scarred for life. But even as the evidence mounted, some of NXIVM's most devoted followers, they just refused to acknowledge the truth. Clare, in particular, continued to defend Raniere. Even after he was convicted, she insisted that she had been part of something meaningful and transformative. And that's what she believed, and that was it. This loyalty, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, further complicated this narrative, as you can imagine. And it's still complicated, but it left many people wondering, how could someone continue to defend a man responsible for such atrocities? Was it a testament to the power of influence, or was it a sign that these individuals were complicit in the crimes themselves? The lines between victim and participant blurred even more as the trial unfolded, leaving the public divided on how to view those who had been involved. In the end, Keith Raniere was sentenced to 120 years in prison for this, but the debate over NXIVM didn't end with the verdict. The case raised deeper questions about the nature of influence, manipulation, and personal responsibility. Were people like Allison and Clare brainwashed, or did they know exactly what they were doing? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if this could happen to them, could it happen to any of us? Well, as the trial of Keith Raniere and his inner circle began, the prosecution wasted no time in outlining their case. They argued that NXIVM wasn't just an unconventional self-help group, but instead a complex criminal enterprise that used psychological manipulation and coercion to trap its members, especially women, into a life of control. Raniere, the prosecution claimed, designed NXIVM to exploit vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities? Yes, because everyone has them. For these guys, it was financial and emotional, manipulating individuals into believing they were working toward self-empowerment, while gradually tightening his grip over their lives. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was DOS, the secret women's group that operated within NXIVM. Far from a supportive sisterhood, DOS functioned under a strict master-slave hierarchy, with Raniere positioned at the very top as the Grand Master. Women who were recruited into DOS were told it was a path toward empowerment, but in reality, they were being groomed for deeper submission. Okay, so to join DOS, women were required to hand over collateral, like I talked about, compromising personal information like, intimate photographs, incriminating confessions. The prosecution highlighted how this collateral, it was not merely symbolic, but it was used as a tool of control, ensuring that these women they couldn't leave the group. They couldn't leave the group or defy Raniere's orders without fearing exposure and total ruin. Witness testimony further illustrated the depths of this coercion. Former DOS members testified about how they were led to believe that the branding ritual, the one where they branded people with Keith Raniere's initials, well, it was a necessary part of their journey. The prosecution stressed that this branding was not consensual in any meaningful sense of the word. These women were coerced and misled and pressured into undergoing the painful procedure, which left permanent physical scars. Text messages between Raniere and his close confidants revealed the orchestrated nature of this branding, showing that Raniere himself had been directly involved in planning all of this. The prosecution painted these acts as not only abusive, but emblematic of the power dynamic that defined DOS. At the heart of the prosecution's argument was the idea that Raniere systematically dismantled these women's autonomy. What appeared to be a voluntary organization on the surface was, in their view, an insidious system where consent was manipulated and coerced at every single turn. The prosecution's message was clear. NXIVM thrived on the ability to control and exploit, creating a climate where the women involved had no real choice but to comply. Now, while the prosecution's narrative centered on coercion and control, the defense countered with a very different story. What could it be? Well, according to the defense, Keith Raniere and NXIVM were not running a criminal enterprise. They were running an organization dedicated to personal growth. Unconventional, perhaps, but it was entirely voluntary. The defense painted Raniere as a misunderstood visionary whose intense teachings were aimed at fostering self-improvement and empowerment, not manipulation or abuse. The core of the defense's argument rested on the concept of consent. They emphasized that every single woman who joined DOS, she did so willingly, and that the exchange of collateral, while unorthodox, it was part of the consensual arrangement. It was designed to demonstrate trust and commitment. The defense argued that branding also, this was consensual, they said, and claimed that the women involved were fully informed about the procedure and that it was a symbolic ritual. It was intended to signify strength and resilience. According to the defense, the prosecution had sensationalized the branding and twisted its meaning to appear more sinister than it actually was. And to bolster their claims, the defense called upon former NXIVM members who testified to all the benefits they gained from Raniere's teachings. These individuals, they spoke of how NXIVM had helped them overcome personal challenges, gain confidence, and even succeed in their careers. The defense argued that for many members, NXIVM was a transformative experience, one that pushed them to become stronger, more capable individuals. They framed DOS as an extension of that ethos, a rigorous yet voluntary commitment to personal empowerment. In contrast to the prosecution's portrayal of Raniere as a manipulative predator, the defense described him as a mentor who provided his followers with the tools to challenge themselves and grow. They claimed that the women in DOS, they were not coerced, they were intelligent, self-sufficient adults who entered the group willingly. At the heart of this defense strategy was the idea that personal responsibility could not be ignored, and they emphasized that every adult who joined NXIVM or DOS had done so of their free will. They brought in people, they brought in experts, and everybody spoke, and each side wanted that win. This is not a manipulation. This is a manipulation. And if people do make their own choice to go in, could it be that the manipulation already started? Isn't that what marketing does? They hook you. It's your choice to buy. But these products aren't jumping out at you and branding you and doing these things to you. So something happens where the person is absolutely committed to all of these things once they're on the inside. In the end, the jury had to weigh these two competing narratives, and the trial left more questions than answers, and the public remained divided long after this verdict was delivered. Even though Raniere was convicted, there were convictions, this case remains deeply controversial to this day, with public opinion far from settled. The media, they too played a pivotal role here, as they seem to always do, in shaping the narrative. They focused on the shocking details like sex cults and branding rituals. These sensational headlines overshadowed the more complex dynamics within this group. Specifically, how is it that intelligent, successful individuals could be drawn into an organization like this? And talk about that. A central point of contention is whether the women involved, especially Allison, the actress, were victims or were they willing participants. Some argue that Allison, with her celebrity status, she was manipulated like everybody else. But others say she was more than willing to go this route for her fame and power. Her and many other members, even after the trial, continued to defend Raniere, and they claimed the organization was transformative for them. And it raised even more questions about the depth of his influence. He was convicted, but they still believed in him. One of the core issues, like I said in this case, was the consent. The prosecution framed NXIVM as a group that systematically dismantled free will, while the defense said, hey, no, these women in DOS, they were fully aware of their choices. I mean, it's the same argument the whole way through, but you have to ask yourself, what do you think? Can people be manipulated? into doing things they would not otherwise do? Or does personal responsibility always prevail? If you did it, too bad. If successful, intelligent individuals can fall under influence like this, what does it say about the rest of us? I mean, public perception has been shaped by the media's portrayal of NXIVM as a sex cult. And in doing this, it left little room for nuanced discussions about influence and consent. Now we're just talking about this sex cult, not the whole bigger problem of why these things continue to happen in our world. And all of this has led to polarizing opinions, with some seeing the actress and the billionaire as enablers who should have known better. Others view them as examples of how anyone can be manipulated. In the end, the NXIVM trial concluded, but the controversy surrounding this case persists. People are having a real hard time deciding whether the people involved here were victims or accomplices, and whether Raniere's influence was as powerful as the prosecution claimed. As more members speak out and new documentaries emerge, I mean, this thing's all over the place, it is clear that the questions NXIVM raises about influence, control, and consent, they resonate far beyond the courtroom. At the end of all of this, as we wrap it up here, it's clear that the NXIVM case, it's not just a story of crime and punishment. And sometimes when things get to court, that's all we see, except what the media tells us. We really need to be persistent in finding out what's really going on in these stories. This is a story about human vulnerability, power dynamics, and the nature of influence. The courts have spoken, and Keith Raniere is behind bars. But the lingering questions remain. They're still out there. Can you make a choice? Were the women involved in DOS people like Allison Mack, people like Clare Bronfman? Were they victims of Raniere's manipulation? They seemed pretty happy doing what they were doing. Were they willing participants who made their own choices? Were they brainwashed? Or did they simply engage in an extreme version of personal development and it all took a dark turn? These questions bring us back to a fundamental issue. How do we as a society view consent and coercion, especially when it involves people we admire? It's easy to look at someone who's vulnerable, down on their luck, and just accept, yep, they were manipulated. That's what happened. But when it's someone with status and wealth and influence, when someone like that falls under the control of a figure like Keith Raniere, somehow we hesitate. It makes us uncomfortable because it's forcing us to confront that uncomfortable reality that anyone, regardless of their position in life, can be manipulated. Even you. And that makes us question not just the individuals involved. It makes us question our own susceptibility to influence. And that's what makes us uncomfortable, right? But maybe it's time to really think about what it means to truly be in control of your own decisions. Is personal responsibility always at the forefront? Or are there moments when influence becomes so powerful that it erodes free will? Were the actress and the billionaire acting under duress? Or were they active participants in something they fully believed in, even as it spiraled out of control? It forces us to think deeply about those lines between influence and autonomy. The truth, as with so many cases that we look at here, it likely lies somewhere in between. That's not awesome. And now, after listening to all of this, I'm turning the question over to you. After hearing the facts and the arguments and the perspectives surrounding this case, where do you stand? Was NXIVM simply an extreme form of self-improvement with willing participants who got in too deep? Or was it a carefully constructed system of control where consent was a mere illusion and manipulation ruled. Think about it. And thank you for joining me on another episode of True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. Stay curious. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.